Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Two Steps Forward, our daily Bible study. I'm James, this is Aid. We're up to episode 230 and 2 Samuel chapter 3. Any initial comments about life or the book of 2 Samuel yet, Aid?
I guess I'm going to tell people about my Whole30.
Okay.
If you're not interested in my diet, fast
forward. If you're not interested,
I'll give myself
ahead.
45 seconds. So I am doing an elimination diet because I have some kind of weird health issues. Like I have pretty bad issues with my TMJ. And I had a CAT scan and it's like progressed to the point of degenerative joint disease on one side, and it flares up. This started the first year I was in school, and it flares up every so often. And it's pretty bad right now. I actually thought it would be completely gone once school was done, but it's from years of like chronic grinding of my teeth. Anyway, when you do an elimination diet, it's basically like no dairy, no alcohol, no gluten, no preservatives, no sugar, because those things have been proven to cause inflammation. So hopefully by eliminating them, I can get the inflammation down. I also have like sinus issues that I think I partially inherited from my dad, but I've had like sinus surgery. So I always feel like I have a little bit of postnasal drip. And my dad went off dairy and he said that really helped him. So I'm hoping that would clear up too. So it's a lot of work, and it's kind of restrictive, but I also think, so I was saying to you, so since I finished school, every day I view as a vacation. So like having a drink every day because I'm on vacation seems normal. And so I'm getting into I've been cultivating some bad habits, like eating too many sweets and like a drink too many times a week.
It's interesting. So we've talked about this before, the idea of intentional fasting, which sometimes is fully from any food except for water, and sometimes is from certain types of foods and that type of thing. And the idea that there might be some wisdom in learning not just the body's sensitivities, but actually in giving your body a rest, like even giving your stomach a rest from digesting either food in general or certain types of things. There probably is some implicit scriptural wisdom in that. This is more just for comfort and health and learning what sensitivities each of us has. But
well, you're not doing it.
Yeah, right. I know. I've done a whole 16. That's as far as I got through it. But no, I got a little bit farther than that. But it's tough, realizing how dependent you are on that type of stuff.
Well, and we consume a lot of like Diet Coke, and anyone who's been with us for a while knows that I like to put marshmallow cream on graham crackers.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure I'm causing some of my own problems.
Right. So, I think that the whole concept of stewarding everything in life, from your time to your money to what you actually put into the most valuable resource you have, which is your body, or physical resource anyways, I think that always makes good sense. So
thank you.
Supportive. Yeah. All right. On to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel 3, read through your copy of 2 Samuel at home. Here's my personal paraphrase. We're actually starting from a continued, in most of your Bibles, there'll probably be a section header that is a continuation from 2 Samuel 2, which says something about war between the houses of Saul and David. But we're told that as time goes on, apparently it's about 2 years, David's forces grew increasingly stronger. The forces of Saul's sons, Saul's dead at this point, but Saul's sons and his loyalists, those forces grow weaker. The text at this point mentions 6 sons of David who are all born to different wives. We'll touch on that. Of note are Amnon, his first son, Absalom, his third son, and Adonijah. All these guys are going to come up again. That's his fourth son. Anyways, as far as Abner is concerned, during the war, Ishbosheth, the last remaining son of Saul, who is now propped up as a king, accused Abner, his military commander of the northern kingdom of Israel, of sleeping with Saul's concubine, a woman named Rizpah. Abner is so upset by this because he was like one of the only people who had the back of Ishbosheth in becoming king. So he was completely loyal to Saul, completely loyal to that family, and now he's became convicted that what the Lord had done, because of this accusation, he's becoming increasingly convicted that what the Lord had promised to David, that he should be king, Abner wants to ensure that as well. And Ishbosheth is now afraid of Abner. He doesn't push him anymore. He doesn't say anything else. Abner then sends David a message that he's going to look for, he's looking for an agreement by which Abner would help unite all of the elders in Israel in the northern kingdom and unite it under David's leadership. David agreed that under the condition that Ishbosheth would send him Michal. Remember, Michal was David's actual first wife, the sister of Ishbosheth, at least a half-sister, but the daughter of Saul, who had already been betrothed to him, already been married to him, but since when David had to go on the run for 10 years, she was given away to another man. So Michal was sent to David, and actually at this point, it's kind of a sad note, her current husband at the time, a guy named Paltiel, we're told, went weeping after her. Abner persuaded the elders of Israel to make David their king. Abner then went to David in Hebron, again in the southern kingdom of Judah, and confirmed that Israel would be his. Joab and his men, remember Joab is David's commander at the time. Joab and his men returned from a battle in which they're securing this great deal of plunder. He learned that David had met with Abner and that Abner left in peace. And so Joab says, that's the enemy. What are you possibly thinking? Joab suspected that Abner was just doing some kind of reconnaissance mission and sort of duping David in this. Joab hunted Abner down and brought him back without David's knowledge, and Joab, avenging the murder of his brother Asahel, which last time we talked about how Asahel, who was the brother of Joab, chased Abner in a little duel they had. Asahel wouldn't give up, and Abner warned him and said, all right, I'm going to kill you, and he kills him. Joab's still upset about all this. So at this point, Joab corners Abner and kills him. David heard about this, and he said that David, was innocent of any of this blood. He makes a public proclamation of this, but that this was Joab's guilt, and he spoke a curse upon Joab's family. David ordered the people to weep in a funeral procession for Abner. David wept for him. He sung a song of lament and fasted. And everything David did was pleasing to the people, and they knew he played no role in Abner, the commander of the North's, death. David explained to his men that he wanted the Lord to always repay the evildoer for his wicked deeds. It's not our job, but it's our job to seek justice. All right, that's 2 Samuel 3. Any initial reactions to that?
So I know it's not fiction, but when I was reading it, I was like, this is why I don't read and don't like fantasy, because I cannot keep everyone straight. There's so many different names, and I think I said I have a little chart in here.
Yeah, that's
that
helpful.
I referred to numerous times.
It's also, again, one of the indicators that these aren't ancient mythology is, number one, they're too specific, and number two, they include redundant names. So there's certain names that come up repeated times for different people, and if you were writing fiction, you would never have two Johns in your story. You would never have.
You're saying they go by two different names?
No, there's that.
Oh,
but
I see.
If you're writing fiction, you want to keep your characters, even if you have a lot of them, you want to keep them as clear as possible. You'll never use the same name on a TV show or a movie or in a book. But in the Bible, sometimes characters have the same name, and it's like, well, is that the same, David or John or whatever? And it's like, I mean, even the disciples, there's redundant names in there. It's like, clearly this isn't fiction, because if it was fiction, you'd never write it that way. It just must be that point. You had two people that had the same name. But it does make it difficult to keep track of. Devotional thought number 1. Does God condone polygamy? I know we've touched on this a couple different times, but I also, I can feel the room. Whenever I preach on this or teach with this, if I don't address it, I can feel like some ire being raised that God would allow something like this. And people get upset, especially women, but not only women. So I just want to run over the biblical teaching here again real quick. Genesis 4, the first polygamist is a guy named Lamech. And we're told, it's noted that he marries two different women. And we're then told that polygamy was tolerated essentially in Israel, but it was forbidden to Israel's king. In fact, specifically it says, Deuteronomy 17:17 says, an Israelite king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. It also says he shouldn't accumulate lots of gold and silver, etc. The confusion, I think, in general, it says he must not take many wives. It doesn't necessarily say he can never have multiple wives. It says he must not accumulate many wives. And so, like, what exactly is the spirit of that? There's some confusion surrounding that, it would seem. And so here we're alerted to the fact that David moves from Hebron. At this point, he has 2 wives. He moves the capital eventually here to Jerusalem. And now he has 6 different wives. And now once he settles in Jerusalem, we're told he takes other wives and concubines. Specifically listed for us is, I think, 17 sons total. And so the question of, like, well, wait a second, how is David getting away with this? And yet God not sending a lightning bolt down to kill him? And kind of like the scholarly answer to this is, so a really famous Hebrew scholar named Robert Alter, who wrote probably the most influential, like, widespread book on Hebrew narrative, it's just called The Art of Biblical Narrative, says in this, if you think that God is tolerating polygamy in the Old Testament, you're not really reading the Old Testament correctly. He says the same thing about the law of primogeniture, the double blessing of the firstborn son. But he basically what he says is every time polygamy comes up, there's always negative consequences.
Yeah.
So David has a family that tears itself apart. In fact, David has his own kids that essentially, like, rape one another and then kill one another. Solomon loses his faith. Abraham's family is corrupted by issues with multiple women. David has his issues keeping his family together because of multiple wives. And essentially what it means then is God's design is always for human flourishing. So if it's one man and one woman in marriage, that leads to human flourishing. When you start disrupting that design, it's not that God immediately sends down lightning bolts, and it's not that God immediately sends somebody to hell, but there are little forces of hell that are released into that relationship, and it always ends up problematic. So I think the question is, how difficult is it for, a modern woman who understands the concept, a Christian woman who understands the concept of a man and woman in the context of marriage? How do you recognize the patriarchy of believers practicing polygamy and yet somehow not just dismiss the whole thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you explained it pretty well. That's exactly what my Bible commentary says, is the numerous sons born to David's wives caused him great trouble. It was a socially acceptable practice, but God warns against it. And they cited the Deuteronomy verse you cited. But so I think that people in general make a lot of exceptions for themselves that maybe technically aren't sinning but aren't healthy spiritually.
You're saying just in general people do
Just
this.
in general.
Yeah.
People still do this today.
Yeah. Violating God's design without necessarily, like, here's the specific command, and they're crossing that line. That's obviously
Which,
sinful.
I don't know, it's kind of sounded like you were making not an argument for the behavior, but justification when you said, well, it doesn't say you couldn't take multiple, it just says, like, many.
Yeah. I think to modern people, it seems so obvious that it should be one man and one woman. You got to be careful about overstating the biblical text, though. So for instance, God's design in the Garden of Eden very clearly is one man and one woman, but you don't actually get the passage about, God's leaders and elders not having multiple wives until you get to the New Testament. So there's this practice. We note that people veer from the design with Lamech, and then it was very commonly the practice in the ancient world. And so, like, did God intervene and say you should never do that? In fact, there is this, we've touched on it, I think, a little bit before, this kinsman redeemer law, where if a brother, your brother dies, his wife needs to be provided for by the family, which may include taking her essentially as a wife. So, very clearly, extramarital sex is wrong. Very clearly, premarital sex is wrong. There's an odd absence of God's critique on patriarchs who take multiple wives, seemingly with good intentions.
Well, so it's a practice of the culture. Like, how many cultural practices do we today as Christians take on that probably God would not recommend or...
Yeah. It's not helpful. The question is it to the point of, like, are you living in unrepented sin?
Yeah, like I'm trying not to state things too strongly, but I'm pretty sure God would be like, you guys don't need to be on social media. Like, it's literally doing no good for you.
Oh. Yeah.
But it's like a cultural norm. It's kind of weird if you aren't.
Yeah.
And okay, I'm
And we
sure
both
some
are.
good things have, well,
To some extent.
I'm sure some good things in the realm of social media have happened, but I think it overall causes more conflict, division amongst Christians, that it's beyond not worth it.
Right. Again, to some extent, that's probably a product of your Enneagram 8 personality that sees things very sort of black and white. I think that it's fair to wrestle with, is this good for me or not, even though it's so obviously part of the culture.
Yeah.
And I think that point is totally
So what I think is more offensive than the polygamy is the fact that, so I don't think that David wanted Michal back because he was like so in love with her. You know, they didn't have a great relationship to begin with.
Right.
The fact that he thinks he can, so my Bible said he probably did it because he thought if he was married to at least one of Saul's daughters, it would be more unifying for the kingdoms.
Yes.
Like the fact that you can just order a woman around like property. So when I think about like, oh, he took so-and-so as a concubine, they were probably fine with that.
Yeah.
Like the woman probably was fine with that.
Yeah.
She like lived in the palace. She was provided for. Her kids were,
Yeah.
you know, whatever. But to take someone who like doesn't, to pull someone away from a different.
Yeah, that's the weird like throw-in detail in this text that I think is like, okay, you can recognize there's like a crack. There's already very clearly some division in Israel, but there's a crack even under David's leadership that he's okay with taking. So this woman is given to another man. What's to say, unless he knows some details about him being a terrible husband, is it really in the best interest to bring her back, tear her from her family, tear her from whatever, especially if it's just for political reasons?
Well, I'm curious if someone would have said to him at this point, so like if he had a Nathan, like he'll have later, if someone would have said to him, like, that's not your wife anymore, like
Well,
it's not appropriate, if that would have maybe prevented him from taking someone else's wife again, like later on.
I think right. Who knows? I think he would say, well, but it is my wife. She was illegally given to him. And so one of the things that you have to understand in what all of that David's doing here is very clearly David as a leader is always pressing towards national unity. And that's why, for instance, he wants to distance himself from the murder of Abner. He wants to make it very publicly clear he had no involvement in his death. David is always working towards unity, and even showing patience and grace. This negatively impacts his own parenting later on. But he almost does it to a fault. But at this point, he thought what Israel needs, what God's people need, is unity. So there's almost a little bit of by any means necessary press towards it, which includes getting Michal back, but. Yeah, is God condoning any of this? No. There's stuff in our lives, as you mentioned, that we're probably absorbing from our culture that is not healthy. If it's not sinful, it's borderline sinful, and
or just causing you, like with all his kids, like just causing you spiritual issues that you could alleviate.
Yeah, and God is bringing about the natural consequences. So when God, who creates those laws, and we violate those laws, he often doesn't just open up the earth and swallow us whole. He often brings natural consequences that discipline us in the process. Devotional thought number 2, we're just going to call him Abner the Pragmatist. At some point, so Ishbosheth accuses Abner, his commander in the north, of sleeping with Saul's concubine. Abner's like, you got to be kidding me. After all I've done for you, as loyal as I am to you, I never did anything like that. He's like, I'm done. I'm switching sides to David. I don't see any of this, by the way, as like repentance. Like, well, because some commentators might say,
did he sleep with her or not?
No. So far as we can tell, no. But like some commentators will say, well, this is Abner wakes up and realizes, nope, the Lord anointed David, and David is supposed to be the king of Israel, and now he's going over to David's side. And I don't know that. I think this is just practical. I think he's like, I'm not going to be on the losing team anymore. I want to go play for the winning team. And he jumps over to David's side. And Abner's a smart guy. He's talented. He very clearly is a good leader. Remember, he rallies all of the northern tribes. He unites all of them and all their elders to say, no, it's in our best interest to start following David right now. But again, he's a pragmatist. He can get results. He gets Michal back to David. He persuades all the elders of Israel to submit to David as the rightly anointed king. Again, I see him as a pragmatist. And the modern application I'd make to this is, so we've talked about this before, the exodus of a lot of Christians from the church in the 21st century. So in the last 20 years, there are more Christians, former Christians, who no longer identify with any religion than we've ever dropped in 20 years in the country's history. And the reason for that, in part, was because these are just people who were pragmatically Christians. They were Christians because it was convenient. They were Christians because their whole social network was Christian. To be perceived as a good person, you had to identify as Christian. We've talked in the early days of America, sometimes you had to identify the church that you went to in order to get a bank loan. So they were Christian for practical reasons. Well, it's no longer become pragmatic to be Christian, and so all of those people are just dropping out of the church. It's not surprising. I actually think in some ways it's culturally, it'll be a shrinking of the church, but it'll be a bolstering of the church. And because most pragmatists, most of those who are just there for pragmatic reasons are going away. And only those who sincerely believe and are willing to experience impractical consequences of being a Christian are those who are staying. To what extent, how would you make a relationship between pragmatism and faith? Like, how important is it for a Christian to just be a pragmatic person? Or are you a pragmatic person, do you think? And how does that impact your faith?
So I think in the workplace, so I know I talk about Ed Harden a lot, but he's such a good example of like sharing the good news.
Remind everybody who he was.
He's a guy who was the COO, the chief of operations at Freighter, the hospital that I work at. But he was a member at our church. But he told the story like in his job interview, or no, I think his boss told this story at his funeral.
Yeah.
In his job interview, he, I guess Ed had like a cross necklace on, and his boss did initiate. He said like, "Oh, I see you have a cross necklace on. Like, what does that mean to you?" And he said that Ed said to him like, "Well, how's your?" And he shared like, "I'm a Christian," and he said, "How's your walk with the Lord?" And I was like, I would never say that in a job interview because I would be like, I would think that the person interviewing me would think, I'm not going to hire this person. Like, they clearly are going to like push their own agenda, which could cause like division, or like, I just try to be as harmonious as possible. Right. And I don't know that that's always like, if someone were to ask me about my faith, and I tell people like, well, yeah, I'm married to a pastor. Like, I feel like that probably says a lot.
You would tell them you're a Christian, but you might not push them on where they're at in their faith.
Where they're at, or I wouldn't like bring it up. And one time Ed said to me, he talked about Jesus. This is before I knew where he worked. He said, I talk about Jesus every day at work. And I said, oh, like, where do you work? And he said, Freighter. And I was like, yeah, okay. Because I had been saying like, well, it might not be appropriate for me like to talk about Jesus. Yeah. Which ultimately I was taking care of people who were dying all the time. Like, those are the people you really is appropriate to talk about spirituality with.
It's interesting. So I talked to his wife, Julie, about that story one time, and she said he wasn't always quite that way, but he kind of grew into it, which also gives me hope that, you know, we will become more comfortable one day just being bold in our Christian witness. I think Ed also had kind of a spiritual gifting of being an evangelist, but the basic idea that picking up your cross to follow Jesus, a cross is always going to be a little inconvenient. It's always going to be a little uncomfortable. And if we're doing what God has called us to do, there's probably going to be something relatively impractical about it. You know, it doesn't just accomplish the results that we want, but nonetheless glorifies God. And, I think he's probably a good illustration of the impracticality of expressing your faith in the current world.
In contrast, in my job interview at Freighter, they asked me what I did in my free time, and I said, I don't know, I like to watch TV.
Also, good results. Yeah, that could
have been any opportunity to be like, well, I'm involved in like small group Bible studies in my church,
Yeah, or just not admit that you watch so much TV.
Okay.
But I'm right there with you.
I actually said I like to watch shock docs, which I thought was a common term, but apparently you said you made it up.
I just made that up.
And they were like, "What? I'm sorry, what?"
Yeah, shocking
documentaries.
All right, devotional thought number 3. Joab's judgment. So remember Joab, again, we're trying to keep these guys straight. Joab is the commander of David's forces in the south in Judah. He has gone on a mission to secure some wealth for Judah. He comes home and he hears that David had this kind of like private meeting with Abner. And Abner's the one who, remember, had killed his brother Asahel in this little duel. It was probably Asahel's fault, but nonetheless, Joab's still upset about it. And he hears that David meets with Abner, and Abner just gets to depart in peace. And Joab comes home and he says to David, essentially, what do you think you're doing? Like, that guy's the enemy. That guy he's probably trying to kill me. He's probably trying to kill you. He might be just lying to you straight up. And Joab is always, you understand it. This is like, anybody who's, a war veteran, I think, has an understandable, reservations. And they know what humans are capable of, kind of thing. And especially if you've been jilted, like Joab has, I think there's some bitterness, some insecurity, some hostility of a wounded military veteran kind of thing. So Joab essentially tracks Abner down, kills him himself. David hears about this. He's like, what are you doing? I'm trying to establish some national unity and national peace here. We were working towards this. David distances himself publicly from Abner's death, and he doesn't have Joab killed because he doesn't know that any more bloodshed is going to be helpful, but he does speak a curse on Joab's house, which is interesting. So, but nonetheless, the entire nation understands that David is distanced from Abner's killing. This has gone too far. I think just in general, we talked about David having this mentality of ends justifies a means. Maybe Joab did deserve to die. This is not, Asahel, remember, was chasing Abner, and Abner's just essentially defending himself. Joab calculatingly, deceptively tracks down Abner and kills him in plain, sight and plain day. It's just murder. It's just a vindictive murder that he had no right to do. That David would be okay with that is probably his patience going too far. Nonetheless, I think in general, his desire for national unity seems about right, and he just wants the bloodshed to end. So how would you, if you were in Joab's situation, that dude killed your brother, that dude's now meeting with the king that you're trying to support and protect, do you think he was justified in tracking down Abner and killing him?
Oh.
Would you do the same thing in that circumstance?
No, but what makes me more angry is, why is David so inconsistent? So, you're going to hear in the next chapter, and before he's done this, people whoever brought Saul's head or whatever, it was instant death. But,
he has that guy killed.
Yes, but he's well, this might benefit me more, so therefore, it's I don't really like that. I'm really starting not to like David. I don't really like his wishy-washy principles when it comes to things like this.
David is the longest, I believe I'm right in saying this, he's the longest personal narrative, not only in the Bible, but in the entire ancient world. The story of David's life is the biggest, longest, most detailed account of any figure we have in the ancient world.
Well, I guess it starts as a child, which not everyone's does. Or a young man.
That's true too. But yes, so many details
Except
about
Jesus,
his life.
But he didn't live very long.
Right. Actually, we have more details about David's life than we have about Jesus' life, even probably. So, it's interesting. But the more you get to know him, so it's part of the reason why he's so relatable, because we have so many details of both his failures and his successes, his repentance and at times his pride and that kind of thing, his inconsistencies, like every other human being. The more you get to know humanity, the more you get a little disenchanted with humanity. And the Bible does not. Again, another reason it's not fiction. The Bible does not hide his faults and his weaknesses. It doesn't just portray him as a hero that conquers giants. It portrays him as a weak man who isn't always as faithful or consistent as he should be. So should we close with prayer? Heavenly Father, thank you for continuing to bless our study of David and his life. And as we just mentioned, David is not merely a hero whose life we're trying to emulate. There are times, certainly, where his heart seeks your righteousness and glory. There are other times where he sins sexually, where he sins by being too political, where he sins by being too fearful, where he sins by not parenting correctly, where he sins by being inconsistent in his leadership. And Lord, all of that we can probably, maybe to some extent, all of those things maybe relate to. So Lord, nonetheless, you show grace to him, patience with him, and continue to lead him to repentance and lead him to grow. We're asking that you do the same with us and continue to learn from some of his mistakes and successes. May it draw us closer to you. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks for studying with us. Did you have something else to say?
Well, I hope I didn't say the social media, that's my opinion. I hope I didn't say it too judgy. And I feel so strongly about it because I've just fallen into that trap.
Yeah.
It just, in my experience, has fostered division and
unhealthy comparison.
Sure, yes. And yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dislike of people because their opinions are out there. And
yeah, I think so. The medium itself is to some extent neutral. I actually just heard a Christian leader explain this really well in a way that I'd never heard before. He said social media, a medium, is something that goes between you and somebody else. Mm-hmm. So when you're trying to, for instance, display your life, just understand social media is not transparency. There is a medium that you're creating some level of distance between you and somebody else by putting something in between you, the social media medium. So in some ways it can maybe help keep us connected, but understand in other ways it's pushing us farther away from people and distorting reality. So I think the Christian needs to understand that it's in and of itself, the tool is neutral. But what does my sinful nature want to do with this tool?
Yeah.
You have to be aware of if you're going to use it properly.
Yes, I'm probably just not mature enough to use it.
Yeah. Well, we're all simul justus et peccator, and we're all grown, simultaneously sinful and justified. So, thanks again for studying with us. We will see you next time for 2 Samuel chapter 4, and actually we're going to do 2 Samuel 4 and 5 if you're reading ahead.